Hello everyone, welcome to Coffee Break, another brilliant show we've got in store for you this week, and I'm delighted to be here with Emily Graham, who, and now I have to look down and read this job title because it's a long one, Chief Equity and Impact Officer, SVP of Diversity and Inclusion for Omnicom Group. Emily, welcome to the show. Great to have you here for Coffee Break.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Wonderful to be here.
Now, we know you well from your role at Fleischmann Hillard, where you were heading up diversity there, but then you took on a wider group role at Omnicom in January, replacing Tiffany Warren. So tell us a bit about the scope of that role, because really interesting role, big shoes to fill with Tiffany, but a great role to get your teeth into. Tell us what the role encompasses.
Sure. So I came over to Omnicom in January. It's been about 4.5 months. I focus on our diversity, equity, inclusion strategy across our global footprint. So that would be about 75,000 employees and just all of our agencies and networks. And the very phenomenal thing about Omnicom that I like is that we actually have a dedicated DE&I lead for our practices and networks. So there's about 30 full-time people focused on DE&I, and I oversee that team. In addition, I have a twin title. I lead our DE&I communications. So I work very closely with our Chief Comms Officer, Joanne Trout, to focus on how we communicate, especially about DE&I. I work with clients. Still, I'm still a communicator at heart. So my ambition is, it keeps you sharp. You do this job and you need to be able to really have two lenses. One is the culture and environment of the company, but in a company like Omnicom, where our clients is our business, you need to be able to connect with them on how DE&I is coming to life for them. So that's my job. It's big, it's exciting. Every day is different and I enjoy it.
Yeah, I think it's good that having the client involvement, because some people think, well, if it's just a DE&I role, you're not able to have as much impact on the business. But if you're involved in client work as well, I think that's a nice way to structure it, isn't it? What was the biggest change, obviously, from doing it for one agency, albeit a big one, to actually covering the whole of the company? How have you changed your perspective?
There's more respect that I have for the different places companies are on the journey. So you just did the big agency report. You reported on how the PR industry is doing on DE&I, and the truth is there's a lot of differences between companies, even though there's similarities. At a company as big as Omnicom, where you have advertising, marketing, PR, everyone's a little bit different in the way they approach diversity, equity, inclusion, and then you have the global footprint, right? And thinking about how the nuances and the cultural pieces come to life outside of the US in places like Asia and places like Africa. So that's different. But the other thing I love that I was surprised by, there's still that entrepreneurial hustle. That's what I love about being at an agency. You still get the scrappiness. You still get people who love to win, who work together and collaborate. You have a lot of that with all these agencies at Omnicom, and you still have that part, which is really important.
With your PR hat on, would you say the PR industry is ahead of the curve in terms of diversity? Is it in the middle? Or is it behind?
You know, we talk about it all the time. That's what we are, we're communicators. So on the one hand, I think just being more transparent and forward, and the fact that we keep it top of mind, I believe makes us a little bit more advanced. I have the vantage point. Obviously, I'm inclined to the PR industry because that's where I come from. But I do believe that part of the challenge with diversity, equity, and inclusion is it's been so complex and hard. People just don't want to deal with it truly. And what I like about the PR industry is we're just dismantling and going to the depths and crevices of why diversity, equity, inclusion in our industry maybe hasn't worked as well, and what we need to do to move it forward. I think advertising and media and marketing are kind of interesting because they use their vehicle. They use ads, they use their power and their platforms to really be able to start to change what we see and what we're hearing. So PR does it in a little bit different way that's influential, but those industries do too.
Yeah, and we get that lens as well because we have our sister brands campaign.
That's right.
Medical marketing and media, and you do get a different sense of where we are. And I do think PR is a bit ahead of the game, I must admit. And if you look at things like the Super Bowl, there were only, I think, 5 Black directors out of 83 films, and there were only 3 women directors, which is even more egregious. But so yeah, I do think there's probably a little bit more ground to make up in some of the advertising areas. But on campaign, we've been tracking some really progressive moves there as well. And talking about that, clearly last year was a fundamental watershed for the feelings around this, both societally, in business, and in communications and marketing. As we've reached this point where, Chauvin has been, he hasn't been sentenced, but the trial has happened. We're coming up on the sort of anniversary of that egregious incident. Where do you think we're at as in business? Because business made a lot of statements. Business and purpose is top of mind. We saw that in the agency report. But people want the talk to be backed up by real actions. Where would you say we are from your vantage point?
My biggest fear, Steve, was a veneer of wokeness, right? I was afraid that we were putting forth our best words, our best statements, our best positioning. I worked with some of the major companies on them. I remember it vividly. I was at Fleischman Hillard when we were counseling those clients and coming up with what and how they move forward. A year later, there is something about the veil being lifted that I think has been illuminating. We've let the sunshine in. Do I think we've made progress? Sure. And the fact that people expect more, that we can't just get by getting by, that there is more accountability required. I do think it remains to be seen, though, because your organization and others are starting to do these roundups. How has the action manifested in change that I can not only see, but that I can feel? Because I want the Black, Brown, LGBTQIA account executive at the agencies who are on the other end of this work to really believe and see that they can and have been changed in the work that they're getting to do, or that the agencies they work for. For clients and corporates, we've seen over the past, 4 weeks, just with the legislation acts that are happening, there's still a paralysis on when and how you engage and why you engage. And I think that is what most companies are grappling with. And if they haven't sorted it out yet, they will have to very soon, which is, what do you believe in and what are you willing to stand upon? And what does value-based leadership really look like? This goes beyond CSR. This goes beyond shareholder value. This goes down to how and where do you begin to make your promises, meet the communities that you're serving, and the money and all the efforts you're putting forth, do they track? And I think some companies are doing outstandingly. I think some companies are stuck in paralysis and others are just middle of the road. And I would love to see more people be honest that you don't have to get it all right, but you can't just stay in the middle. You do have to move in this time.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not easy. These are very tricky waters for brands to come into. And I think that's why PR firms especially had actually quite not a positive year, but they did. The whole industry was up a couple of percent in the US because companies wanted advice and counsel on those sort of issues, for sure. One issue that I did want to bring up with you, is Omnicom decides not to release its diversity figures for its staff, overall workforce. And I just wonder why that was, because obviously we had the Hold the Press movement last year, a lobbying group of young principally black PR people who said, look, companies need to be open here and they need to say where they're at if we're going to move the ball forward on this. And some companies came out and have done it, even if it didn't look great for them, but others haven't. And Omnicom is one of those, WPP another. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that numbers matter. I think they're part of progress, but they don't alone equal progress. I understand the frustration. I get why there is some consternation as to why and how companies as big as Omnicom haven't released that data. But what I would say is that Omnicom has released information that shows our stakeholders, shows the people that we do business with that we're serious. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in, Steve, with clients, our leading top clients across Omnicom, where I'm telling our strategy, showing them what we're doing. And the fact is, when I look around Omnicom and I see the fact that we have 30 full-time dedicated DE&I leads, and every agency and network has KPIs, and everybody has a structure where they're really going to their CEOs and talking about this on a regular basis, it makes me feel optimistic. And I know that there is going to be a lot of pressure and questions that continue to come, and they should come. And I think that as time progresses, things have progressed. And I hope that we start to look at progress more than just one part, but multiple parts.
Yeah, sure. It's a multiple part process.
Yeah.
I mean, but is that something you're going to lobby for internally, that maybe Omnicom could get to a stage where it can be transparent on numbers like that?
Yeah, if you know me, Steve, you know I lobby. You know I lobby. Look, I will do what I think with our leadership that makes sure that we continue to make everyone know this is a commitment of ours. It is strongly, strongly, strongly centered to our strategy. Diversity, equity, inclusion is not adjacent. I came from an agency where I was working with the CEO every day on how we move DE&I to the center of our business, and I'm doing the exact same thing at Omnicom.
So we had Soon-Mi Kim on on our podcast
Yeah.
a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about the Stop Asian Hate movement, and that's something that's blown up more this year.
Yeah.
What's your, and you at Omnicom have done some awareness raising around that. Tell us what you've been doing firstly, but also what are the differences and similarities between the Black Lives Matter protests and Stop Asian Hate? Because some people think maybe this hasn't been taken as seriously, and actually it's just as egregious in many ways.
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is just what you brought up, that 3 and 5 campaign. You talked to Soon-Mi most recently. It's an example of how Omnicom uses its platform for power. That's an example of the progress. That's an example of accountability. We have some of the biggest agencies in the world who influence advertising and marketing, and we've put a call to action out to an entire industry, multiple industries. I think that's how I would like to see more companies using their platforms to move diversity, equity, inclusion forward. Has it been taken as seriously? I hate the oppression Olympics, Steve. I think in this job, the one thing I hear every day is some version of, well, why haven't we when we did this? And I get why people are asking that. And what I'd ask us to do is take a step back and recognize that allyship and advocacy is not a versus exercise. Allyship and advocacy means that we mind the gap and stand in for others in other communities. I have seen more allies in the Black community and the Asian community share common experience right now than ever before. I've seen more advocates say, now I can see a little more clearly why Black Lives Matter was so emphatic on all the tragedy and the grief that you've all been experiencing, because this has been a lot for me as a member of the Asian community. I think culturally, from what I've learned, and Soon-Mi has been instrumental in this as other members of our team, is that there's culturally a little bit difference in how the Asian community has talked about oppression, how they have been regarded when they talk about it with others. It's almost like a silent suffering that has been expected, and that's frustrating. I think that's why we're hearing such a rallying cry and a movement now, and I am so proud of that to hear it. But you shouldn't have to yell uncle before somebody really pays attention to you. I think with Black Lives Matter, George Floyd changed the world. If we had not seen that 17-year-old's video, there's no way that we would be talking about DE&I every single day the way we do in our industry. So I think the difference, unfortunately, is the magnitude of tragedy and the cataclysm of how it all comes to life. But there's no difference in what rooted it all: racism, systemic inequity, supremacy. And that's what we have to battle. It's not each other. It's the things that have caused what's happened.
Yeah, I mean, and now we know that police are carrying cameras. They have to deploy the cameras. So we're possibly seeing things that may have been going on for generations, which we know have been. And on the Asian population, yeah, I think that was happening in New York even, which is supposedly a progressive city before COVID lockdown. We were hearing about attacks in New York on Asian people and also LGBTQI people in town, and you're like, really, this is New York? This is supposed to be the most progressive place,
city in the world, right?
Yeah. So,
but the thing is that when I lived in New York and I've seen all the things I've seen for the past 10 years, is as diverse as a city as it is, and as much as we love it, there are still these nuances and pockets where people can be harmful to one another in these communities that have been well established for years. And I saw a lot of good conversation about why there's such a chasm, for instance, between the Black community and the Asian community. I think we need to run towards that. See, we can't like sweep that. There's a reason why there's been so much tension between Stop AAPI Hate and Black Lives Matter. It's because there's been some deep history between these communities. And I'm glad to see that we're uncovering more about what that is so we can get past it.
Yeah, well, we wish you well with that, Emily, and great to chat to you. Thanks for joining us for Coffee Break, and congrats on the new role, and really looking forward to seeing what you do with it.
Thanks for having me.